Remote Indigenous Education, Australia. Steve Tribbeck will be talking about the role of education in remote Indigenous communities, schools and family education, bilingual versus unilingual, interviewed by Ada Mertz. ConsciousEarthAlliance.com.
Welcome, Steve.
Thank you so much for the invite to come and speak with all of you. So what I'd like to do before I launch into the more remote localities and educational facilities here in Australia is draw a little bit of context for you all with regards to some of the struggles for Indigenous people here in Australia. Within the standard education systems, both in the cities, and I'm going to be quoting mostly Northern Australia here, which is where the majority of Indigenous people live. There are terrible problems with education, with children turning up to school. There's only I have done a little bit of research. There's only 39% of students turning up to school. So school engagement is very, very low. So around about a third of students attend school. And there's all sorts of government programs happening to try and deepen engagement. And of course, this is very, very standard school programs. And there's a lot of really detrimental issues that are going on within Aboriginal communities. The social chaos within their communities itself, I liken that to a huge amount of white noise and chaos. You've got the highest consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages, Coca-Cola, globally, and Coca-Cola actually aims their marketing at these low socioeconomic and Indigenous groups because that's where their highest profit margins are. And another absolutely terrible statistic, we've got the highest rate of youth suicide in Northern Australia than anywhere else on the planet. So education for Aboriginal people is very, very dysfunctional. Of course, it's all very Western-based education, and very, very colonialist. And so, oh, you're back, Ada. Disappeared there for a while. Then moving, so that's, and again, I'm sharing this as a precedent across the very much the top of part of Australia, which is where the majority of the population of Indigenous people are actually are living. So then moving out into communities, and this is where this whole issue with regards to bilingual versus unilingual education starts. And there's one very large community in Western Arnhem Land, and I might try and place Arnhem Land for everyone who's listening. So central Northern Australia, you've got the large state of the Northern Territory, and Arnhem Land exists in the top right quadrant of that state. It's a really, really incredible territory in that it is mostly Indigenous run. You've got to get a permit to go into the into those areas. There's a number of communities. I would say around 12 communities, some housing up to 2,000 to 3,000 people in those communities. They've all got schools in those communities, and they pretty much replicate a normal school that you would have in a Western community. And some of them are bilingual and some of them are unilingual. And I've got one community that I actually visit quite often in Western Arnhem Land, a place called Goombalanya. And the principal of the school there only runs a unilingual education program. And every single time I see Esther, I have conversations with her to try and help her understand the importance of bilingual education. As you preserve Indigenous languages, you preserve Indigenous perspective, and that is just so critical for the the survival of culture, survival of connection with land. So moving from, you know, the way that unfortunately choices are made around how education works for Indigenous people in Australia through unilingual to bilingual, out into an example of an incredible education system in an amazing community called Doublewhanau in the central Arnhem Plateau. So this is some of the most remote parts of Australia, if not the world, where there's this tiny little, it's actually a tiny little school. They've got about 16 students at this school, and it's the only school in Australia that's not sponsored by the government or funded by the Australian government. And this is a very, very, very raw grassroots school where students are learning from the country, basically. So learning on country programs. So and a huge part of that is the importance of language and connection with culture, cultural perspective that's passed down over tens of thousands of years. That is so critical for the role that these individuals will play in the greater community as they grow up and mature into those specific roles, which may be roles in areas of dance, storytelling, art. This community is very, very strong in art. It's actually was founded by an amazing man, Professor Nabarel Najmerik. He's the senior man. He's passed away now, bless him. and he has art in places all over the world. He's absolutely extraordinary artist. So one of the things that that is, because I want to try and link it into how home educators, families at home, parents, carers can really look at ways and means of educating their own children using these kinds of systems. I've had many years of experience in outdoor education, and which very much replicates some of what goes on within these indigenous education systems, where embodied wisdom is something that's really valued, and that is experiential based learning. And I'm hearing from a lot of the other speakers, there's aspects of this experience-based learning within villages and various other means. So you've got kids out on country in Arnhem Land learning directly from elders, from in this case with the school at Doublewhanau. There are a couple of teachers there now, so a couple of white teachers and an administrator, which is absolutely fantastic. It's such an incredible precedent for Aboriginal education here in Australia. And so coming back again to this whole concept of embodied wisdom and experience-based learning, where students are out in the Australian bush, and like I'm saying, it's extraordinarily remote areas, learning about connections, relationships, learning about weather patterns. And so there's real life skills that are actually coming out of as far as learning outcomes are going with these groups and with these kids. And of course that affirms a continuance in their role in culture. They understand the role of integrity or rapery, which has to do with the overarching principles that hold together culture and all of those really complex system of relationships. And one of the biggest thing is that, every aspect of their education is in accord with nature. And so nature is plays a huge role within the teaching structure and system, and the individual's relationship within that system and structure. So I could talk a little bit about that relationship system. It's remarkable in that an individual student, Aboriginal person, will have a relationship with every single plant, animal, creepy corally, even the direction of the wind. And it's determined it's a matriarchal system. It's determined by obviously their mother's skin, and they come in with with a relationship that determines which part of the ecosystem that they take care. So they're caretakers for certain parts of the ecosystem, and it might be a plant, it might be an animal, it might be some Dreamtime concept or sort of concept of creation story concept that they will look after through art, storytelling, dance. So it's a extraordinarily deep and complex relationship system.
Experience-based learning, this is the best way for children to learn, using your body, your senses. I mean, that not only from the perspective of learning, but it's so healthy because it's like the body is moving in coherence with the heart and with the intelligence, and it's just one big system which is being utilized at that particular moment. Could you maybe give some examples of that?
Well, look, some of the learning on country programs that happen, I know, in some of these really remote parts of Australia, is where a community of children, basically under the guidance of adults, will trek across country, and they will travel many hundreds of kilometers from one community to another. So retracing some of those trade routes and some of those and visiting parts of their homeland that they wouldn't ordinarily get to, because you can't drive to these places. They're extraordinarily remote, and there's stories that are associated, cultural stories that carry certain morals, that there's parts of ecosystems that will only grow certain plants, and there'll be certain animals in those areas, so they get to go and visit those ecosystems and learn about them and learn about the roles that they actually play in maintaining that ecosystem through their storytelling, dance, through their art, and it's a very very beginning process of their understanding of what I call ecosystem engineering, which has to do with this really refined means of perspective, or cultural perspective, that is then laid upon the land through art, storytelling, their ceremonies, of course, and it's a very refined and very complex system, and it's been, like I say, refined over tens of thousands of years.
Would you say that in that circumstance, the kids, they develop a certain intelligence that no other children could develop?
Well, look, that intelligence, yes, the answer to that is yes. The intelligence that exists within Aboriginal, these very remote Aboriginal cultures, is passed down into through their generations. It's within their DNA. It's a case of remembering who they are through the experiential learning-based processes. And of course, we're all Indigenous to one part of the world or another. And so to be able to apply that to our situation is to do basically the same, to help us remember the role that we play within relationships in the environment, how we can become caretakers and engineers of ecosystems. We're really good at doing it with cities and being engineers within cities. But what about the role that we play in engineering ecosystems. And it has everything to do with the work that we do on the inside, our attitude, as far as our attitude, the way that we see the land, and it's sitting down with elders in this part of Australia. They will talk about the land. They say that the land is as you see it, and of course they're not talking so much about their eyes. They're talking about their whole everything about them, the way that you see the land is, and it's the means of disturbing the quantum field, in a sense, and they're disturbing it in a way that's completely in accord and understanding that the role that they play within that disturbance. Even as apex predators, of course, they have a huge impact on the overall ecosystem. So it's so most definitely there's they are relearning something that is so deep within them.
Mm. Because you see, if you're living in a city, your sense of perception, your senses become so dull, and I can imagine there's such a big difference already there, between the sense perception of city dwellers and Aboriginals. It's a huge, big difference.
Yeah, well, look, there's so much noise in the city, and it's not so much the noise that reaches our ears. It's all of that. There's a whole. It's just absolutely insane. Just the electromagnetic noise. There's just so much going on, and there's very little of it that's actually in accord with nature. So as far as experiential-based education systems, getting out there into nature, getting out there into parks, even learning about trees, learning about weather patterns, learning about animals and relationships, learning about fungi and how an incredible mycorrhizal relationships between trees and fungi, and this is all the stuff that goes on in Indigenous communities, where they become literally masters in their understanding of what goes on within ecosystems and the role that they actually play, the intimate role that they play within that.
I see a lot of similarities with new humanistic education, though with Indigenous education, of course, it's much more and deeper, maybe, and different. So I would almost like to rename it as relational education. Isn't it?
Yeah.
Very beautiful.
Yes. It is. It's
as
very
you're
much.
Talking, this is what I'm getting from you. Yeah.
Because schools don't teach kids how to learn. And of course, having children out there in the natural environment, on country, as they call it here in Australia, they are taught to learn. So it's less about what's taught and what comes from a teacher, more about the experience that is then embraced completely. And of course, once that's embraced, it becomes embodied, and it's something that you don't forget.
Hi, Stephen. And thanks for being here. I grew up in Australia, and I already thought when I was in grade 3 of standard school, I thought, this is weird. We're not learning the history of our land, and I don't know, it just made sense to my young, untainted brain that we should actually listen to the First Nations people and somehow incorporate ourselves into their shepherding of the land and their culture. And of course, we just did a horrific job of that. And thank God for people like you, Stephen, who do work with the Indigenous communities to preserve their incredible ways. We learnt, we read some small literature about the Dreamtime stories, and it was presented almost in a mocking way, these people, they imagined that the land was made by, giant animals, and ha ha ha. And to me, it was like a discord, because with my 8-year-old brain, of course, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Of course, that's how the world was created,
Yes.
And just such a gorgeous culture to have interacted small amounts with.
Last question here for Steve. Diet, does it affect children as well? And what are they doing to avoid negative impact of sugar.
It's just such a difficult situation that's going on in these communities. The larger communities, like I said earlier, you've got the highest consumption of Coca-Cola per capita than anywhere else in the world in Northern Australia, in remote parts of Northern Australia. The impact of sugar sweetened beverages alone is horrendous. Then you've got all of the refined foods, flour, very, very basic refined foods that are consumed by people in communities. They get dietitians to come in to help advise people to change diets, and they replace sugar with chemicals. And of course, the chemical sweeteners are even worse for people than the sugar-based sweeteners. So there's terrible education, terrible advice that's coming through. But then you move one step away from those larger communities that have got a reasonably, well, a conventional supermarket, which is where they're sourcing most of their food, out into the remote homelands, of which Doublewhanau is an example. There is no store. There is no supermarket. And part of that learning process that's happening with the kids is that they're out on country learning and hunting and gathering food. And I can just remember, it reminds me of an experience I had with this little boy, Idris, who, it's this sweet little kid. We were walking across country, would have been 25 years ago. And Idris was very, very close with me, and we'd be walking together in one group. No one was really saying anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. And yet there was a huge amount of communication going on. And Idris would run off and pick billy goat plums from a nearby tree. He'd be climbing up in the tree, and he'd be filling his mouth with these plums, and he'd have 2 handfuls, and he'd come running up to me, and he'd empty one of his handfuls into my hand, and then he'd clench that hand shut, which meant that I wasn't to eat what he's just given me. He'd empty his mouth out and then eat what he could, came and get his little store out of my hand. And the next time he did that, he'd come through and he'd put it in my hand, and he'd look up at me and say, well, that's yours for helping me gather. And of course, those billy goat plums, they've the highest vitamin C that you can get in certainly any fruit here in Australia, whether it's traditional fruit or contemporary fruit. And there's a lot to be said about what's gained through that kind of understanding of country, of plants, their relationships with animals, their understanding that consciousness chooses form to express, and they're constantly working on this very, very deep conscious level with fabricating ecosystems. This concept of dream time, it's a colonialist concept. Songlines is a very colonialist concept. It's all way, way, way more complex than that when you get into the real nitty-gritties of what's happening at deep cultural levels. Their ideas, and they make reference, those colonialist ideas make reference. So coming back to what Paul said, it's really, really quite difficult to bring education into our system, because their ideas and concepts are so different to what ours are. All at the same time, we're certainly not providing any kind of understanding within even the school systems now that brings any kind of sort of respect or honor or to our Indigenous nations, our First Nations people here in Australia.
Okay, thank you, Steve.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you, Ada.
Contributing.